There is a war on the Great Lakes that can never be won. For 70 years, the United States and Canada have spent tens of millions of dollars a year, in some years close to 25 million, hunting and killing a single creature. Not to wipe it out. They gave up on that long ago. They spend all that money simply to hold it back for 12 more months, and then they do it again. It sounds insane, pouring a fortune forever into fighting one fish most people have never heard of. But stop for a single season, and an entire chain of life comes apart. And here is the part nobody saw coming. Somewhere in the middle of that endless war, something returned to these lakes that scientists had already written off as gone for good. Something they were certain could never come back on its own. To understand the war, you have to go back to the world before it, to the Great Lakes as they had been for 10,000 years. 5 enormous inland seas, carved by glaciers holding nearly 1/5 of all the fresh surface water on the planet. Cold, deep, and clear. And in that cold water ruled one fish above all others. The lake trout. A heavy, slow-growing, long-lived predator that could live for decades and top 40 pounds. The wolf of these waters, sitting at the top of the food web. Everything below it, and a fishery that fed a whole region, was built on the back of that one fish. Before the trouble began, the two countries pulled about 15 million pounds of lake trout out of the upper Great Lakes every single year. It fed families and built towns. Whole communities along those shorelines had lived and worked by that fish for generations. It felt permanent, the way the lakes themselves felt permanent. And for all that time, the lake trout was protected by a single accident of geography. Niagara Falls. A wall of falling water more than 150 feet high, Niagara was a barrier no ocean creature could ever climb. It sealed the 4 upper Great Lakes off from the Atlantic like a locked door, and everything inside had evolved in that safety, with no defense against the animals of the sea. For thousands of years that door held. Then people built a way around it. To move cargo ships past the falls, engineers dug a shipping canal called the Welland Canal, a staircase of locks that lifted vessels up and over the barrier that Niagara had always been. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, they deepened and widened it again and again to carry bigger ships. It was a triumph of commerce. It was also, without anyone realizing it, an open gate. And through that gate, swimming up out of the Atlantic and into the undefended heart of the continent, came a creature these waters had never seen. It had first appeared in Lake Ontario, below the falls back in the 1800s, and Niagara had kept it penned there, harmless for decades. The canal changed that. One improvement at a time, the door swung wider until the path meant for ships became a path for the parasite too. At first, there were only a few. Nobody understood what had just been let in. The Invader was the sea lamprey, and to understand the damage it did, you have to look at what it truly is. The sea lamprey is not a fish in the way we picture one. It is something far older and far stranger, a jawless, eel-shaped creature from an ancient branch of life that was swimming in the oceans before the first dinosaurs walked. It has no scales and no jaw. What it has instead is a mouth like a round suction cup, a disc lined with ring after ring of curved teeth and a rough, rasping tongue in the center. It hunts by latching on. A sea lamprey fastens that sucker mouth onto the side of a living fish, grinds a hole through the scales and skin, and drinks, feeding on the blood and body fluids of its host, while the fish is still alive. Most fish it attaches to do not survive. And a single sea lamprey, over its life as a parasite, kills between 20 and 40 pounds of fish. The animals of the Great Lakes had never faced anything like it. They had spent their entire evolutionary history behind the wall of Niagara, with no parasite of this size and no defense against one. To the sea lamprey, the lakes were a buffet with no locks on the doors. By the 1920s and the 1930s, the lampreys had spread through the canal into the upper lakes, one after another. And in the late 1940s, their population exploded. What happened next was one of the fastest ecological collapses ever recorded. The lake trout, the 40-pound king, the fish the entire system rested on, was hit hardest of all. Catches that had held steady at 15 million pounds a year began to crater. By the early 1960s, the harvest had fallen to about 300,000 pounds. That is a collapse of 98%. In the span of a single generation, the fish had all but vanished. It happened so fast that fishermen who had built their whole lives around the lake trout watched it disappear inside their own careers. Nets that once came up heavy, now coming up empty, season after season. And the numbers behind that collapse are almost hard to believe. At the peak of the invasion, sea lampreys were killing more than 100 million pounds of Great Lakes fish every year, 5 times the amount human beings were catching. Of the fish that managed to survive an attack, as many as 85 out of every 100 carried the wounds, the raw circular scars where a lamprey had latched on and fed. Fishermen were hauling up nets full of dying, disfigured fish, each one branded with the same round wound. In 3 of the lakes, Ontario, Erie, and Michigan, the lake trout was effectively wiped out, locally extinct, gone. And when the top predator falls, everything beneath it tips out of balance. The whole web of life that the lake trout had anchored for 10,000 years began to come undone. People tried to fight back, and at first they lost. They strung electrical barriers across rivers to shock the lampreys as they swam upstream to breed. They built mechanical weirs and traps. It slowed a few of them. But the sea lamprey bred in hundreds of separate streams and tributaries feeding the lakes, and there was no way to block or trap them all. For every river guarded, a dozen others ran open. A single female lays tens of thousands of eggs. Trying to catch them one by one was like bailing out the ocean with a bucket. An entire inland sea, and no one on Earth knew how to save it. By the end of the 1950s, the greatest freshwater fishery on the face of the Earth was, for all practical purposes, dead. Its top predator was gone, its economy was shattered, tens of thousands of jobs had evaporated, and nothing anyone had tried could turn it around. It looked like the end. So a small team of scientists gave up trying to fight the adult lamprey in the open water, and went looking for a different kind of weapon entirely. Their idea was to attack the lamprey where it was weakest. Because before a sea lamprey ever becomes a blood-drinking parasite, it spends years as something else. A soft, blind, harmless larva, buried in the mud of the same streams where it was born. If you could kill it there in the riverbed, you could wipe out an entire generation before it ever reached the lakes. It was a strange inversion of the whole problem. Instead of chasing a fast, elusive parasite across 5 enormous lakes, they would strike it while it lay still and defenseless in the mud of a few hundred rivers. So they went searching for a chemical that could do it, and they were hunting for something that sounded impossible. A poison selective enough to kill lamprey larvae, buried in a stream bed while leaving the trout, the minnows, and every other fish in that same water completely unharmed. They tested compound after compound. Thousands of them, by some accounts more than 6,000 different chemicals, screened one at a time, searching for the single molecule that could thread that needle. It was slow, discouraging work. testing compound after compound in tanks, watching most of them either fail to kill the lampreys or kill everything in the water. For years, nothing worked well enough. Then, one chemical at a time, they began to narrow in on a family of compounds that seemed to strike the lampreys harder than anything else they had tried. And in 1958, against long odds, they found it. The chemical was given a shorter name, TFM. Poured into the streams at a carefully measured dose, it did exactly what they had barely dared hope. It killed the buried lamprey larvae and left the other fish swimming. For the first time, humans had a weapon that struck the parasite in its cradle. Treated stream by stream, year after year, the sea lamprey population began to crash. Within years, across much of the Great Lakes, it had fallen by around 90%. It was the turning point of the entire war, the first time anyone had ever landed a real blow on the sea lamprey, instead of simply absorbing them. The bleeding had finally stopped, and in the cold, deep water of the largest lake of all, in the silence after the parasite's grip was broken, something began to stir that no one had promised would ever return. The lake trout, the vanished king, the fish that had been declared gone from lake after lake, was coming back. And not just the hatchery fish that managers had been dumping in for years to prop things up. Wild trout. Fish being born in the lakes again on their own in places they had been absent from for half a century. It was the thing scientists had quietly stopped expecting. A fish written off as functionally extinct across much of its range was, without being asked, beginning to rebuild itself. To understand how one chemical could rescue an entire fishery, you have to understand the strange double life of the animal it targets. A sea lamprey does not spend most of its life as a parasite at all. After hatching, it burrows into the soft sediment of a stream and stays there as a larva for anywhere from 3 to 6 years, blind, toothless, filtering tiny scraps of food out of the water, doing no harm to anything. Only after those years underground does it transform into the blood-feeding monster and swim down into the lake. That long, hidden, helpless childhood is the one moment the lamprey is exposed. TFM works by exploiting a weakness in that larva's body chemistry. The compound is toxic to the buried lampreys because, unlike trout and most other fish, the lamprey cannot efficiently break the chemical down and clear it from its system. So it accumulates, and it kills. The scaly fish sharing that same stream simply break the compound down and survive. In a sense, TFM doesn't so much poison the lamprey as expose a gap in its ancient body, a weakness left over from hundreds of millions of years of evolution that the newer fish around it don't share. It is, in effect, a poison keyed to a single flaw in a single animal, the sharpest possible tool, aimed at the parasite's nursery. Getting the dose right is a science of its own. Too little and the lampreys survive. Too much and it begins to harm the fish it is meant to protect. Every treated stream has to be measured and dialed in over and over, year after year. But TFM alone was never going to be enough, and this is where the war became permanent. Killing lamprey larvae in the streams is only one front. Today the control program layers weapon on weapon, low barriers built across rivers to stop adult lampreys from reaching their spawning grounds, traps that capture up to 40% of the adults in a stream. And one of the strangest tactics of all, capturing male lampreys, sterilizing them, and releasing them back to compete for mates and father nothing. Together, these tools pin the population down at a fraction of its peak. It is a permanent siege, fought across thousands of miles of shoreline and hundreds of rivers, every year without fail. But not one of them can finish the job. The sea lamprey cannot be eradicated, only held down. Miss a few streams, ease off the treatments for even a season, and the survivors breed back with astonishing speed, undoing years of progress in months. That is the brutal arithmetic behind the $25 million bill that arrives every single year. It does not buy victory, it buys another 12 months. And here, Honesty matters more than a tidy story. Because killing the lamprey opened the door for the lake trout, but in some lakes it was not enough on its own. In Lake Huron, the trout still would not reproduce for decades after the lampreys were beaten back. The reason was a second invader. A small Atlantic fish called the alewife had also poured in through the canals, and it was quietly sabotaging the trout's recovery in two ways. It ate their newly hatched young, and when adult trout fed too heavily on alewife, a chemical in the alewife left the trout unable to produce healthy offspring. For years, biologists watched adult trout return to the old reefs, lay their eggs, and produce almost nothing that lived. The lampreys were beaten, and still the young trout vanished. The comeback was stuck. Then, around 2003, the alewife population suddenly crashed, and almost immediately, the lake trout of Lake Huron began spawning successfully in the wild again. The impossible recovery, it turned out, was completed not by one solution, but by the removal of two different invaders, one killed on purpose over decades, and one that collapsed by accident. It was a reminder of how tangled these systems can be. Pull one thread and you rarely get only what you intended. Sometimes the fix you spend decades engineering only works once a second problem quietly solves itself. Today, the sea lamprey population across the Great Lakes sits about 90% below where it stood at the peak of the invasion, and it stays there only because the war never stops. On the strength of that control, the Great Lakes fishery has been rebuilt into something now worth more than $5 billion a year. And in 2024, in the cold, deep water of Lake Superior, fishery managers announced something that would have sounded like a fantasy 60 years earlier. The lake trout, the vanished king, wiped out or gutted across much of its range, had been declared fully restored. Its numbers were estimated to be at or above where they had stood before the sea lamprey ever came through the canal. 60 years after it had been declared gone, the wolf of the Great Lakes was hunting its old waters again. A native predator, erased across the heart of a continent, was once again sitting at the top of its world and breeding on its own. But no one is calling this a clean victory. Because it isn't one. The recovery holds only as long as the spending does. Cut the funding, relax the control, and the sea lamprey would come roaring back within a few short years, dragging the lakes back down with it. The Great Lakes today are crowded with other invaders, and the balance is fragile. In some lakes, the native fish still lean heavily on stocking to survive. This is not a war that was won. It is a peace that has to be renewed by hand every single year, most likely forever. And that is the quiet lesson buried in this whole story. Against an invader that has truly taken hold, there may be no such thing as a final victory, only the willingness to hold the line, season after season, and never put the weapon down. But there is a strange kind of hope in it, too, because the moment humans loosened the parasite's grip even a little, the lake trout came pouring back through the opening faster than anyone believed it could. Nature had been waiting the whole time, pressed against the door. There is a war on the Great Lakes that can never be won, and yet, in the fighting of it, the thing everyone swore was gone forever came home. If you are drawn to stories like this, nature clawing its way back the instant we give it half a chance, then this channel was built for you. Because the Great Lakes are not the only place locked in a fight like this. Across the continent, other waters are holding invisible battle lines.